and should be a couple seconds.
Well, someone on the live chat just said hello.
I think we're here. I think we're live. Excellent. Well, thanks so much, everyone, for joining us here this evening. My name is RJ Shepard. Use he, him pronouns, and I am one of the co-chairs of ByCloud PDX. We're here this evening to introduce a great speaker who has a new book out, Angie Schmitt. Before we do that, I just want to give folks a quick intro in case you're not familiar with ByCloud. We're an organization here in Portland, Oregon. We're about 6 years old now, and we primarily advocate for improving Portland's bicycling network and removing barriers to bicycling for people of all ages, abilities, gender, and so on. So one thing that I think we're all very much aware of is, and Angie will very much get into this later, is the increasing deaths of individuals who are vulnerable road users. Unfortunately, ByCloud has hosted many memorials for victims of traffic violence. We've had this past year 22 deaths, or sorry, this year alone, we've had 22 deaths on our roadways. And last year, we had 51 deaths from traffic violence, which is the highest number of deaths in Portland as a result of traffic violence since 1997, which is just crazy. And I do want to mention as a caveat, this in no way should diminish the lives of that have been lost to police violence, hate crimes, and obviously in today's global pandemic, the coronavirus, which we know have been disproportionately impacting people of color, particularly Black, Indigenous communities. So I do want to thank all of you for joining us this evening. If you're at all interested in ByCloud and learning more, please sign up for our newsletter. You can do that by going to signup.bycloudpdx.org. That's once again, signup.bycloudpdx.org. And I'll go ahead and throw a link down in the video description as well. And with that, I am super, super thrilled to introduce Angie Schmitt, who has been a former writer and editor at Streets Blog. She was there for 9 years, I believe. She has written on many transportation subjects, including bicycling, but also public transit, walking. She's definitely not shied away from the political sphere as well, talking about how the Koch brothers attempted to undermine public transit, and also has some really interesting thoughts on how the Democratic Party needs to really broaden its vision for urban transportation. She's got a new book now in pre-order called Right of Way, Race, Class, and the Silent Epidemic of Pedestrian Deaths in America. And it is on pre-order. And we've got a special 20% off discount. Angie's publisher sent us that. You can check it out in the description as well. By using the promo code Schmitt, you can get 20% off. And so with that, I'm gonna hand it off to Angie, who's got a great presentation set up for us. So thank you very much, Angie, for joining us this evening.
Yeah, hi, thanks for having me. So it's great to be virtually back in Portland. I was actually there, I did a presentation at Portland State in the fall. Since then, the book got finished. I finished writing this book in February, sort of right before the world fell apart. And I was just kind of sitting back thinking, okay, come out. And obviously everything has changed. So to jump off, I want to talk just a little bit about Corona and what we've seen with the protests and
sure.
So none of that stuff, I finished writing the book in February, so none of that stuff is referenced in the book at all. But I do think there is some relevance in some ways. So one of the themes of the book is obviously about racism and the way racism is institutionalized and in our systems, in our road systems, in other ways, in the legal system, even in the way we sort of assign blame and conceptualize the problem, I think is colored by the status of the victims, not just their race, but also other socioeconomic factors that I'm going to discuss a little bit. But it's similar to what we've seen in other fields, how there's more discussion now about racism in healthcare and how that leads to unequal outcomes. That kind of thing is apparent. It shows up a lot in this problem, and it's part of what the book's about. And I also think some of the discussions we're having right now about how much we should do to protect people from dying and what kind of sacrifices we're willing to make to protect people are relevant, although I'm sad about the way it's playing out.
Absolutely.
So anyway, it's all very heavy stuff, and trying to promote a book in this environment is a little weird in some ways, but I think in some ways, it'll be relevant and timely, hopefully. So, so anyway, the first slide I have in this presentation shows the increase in pedestrian deaths we've seen, and in the last year that we had full data, when this presentation or when the book was completed, we had about 6,200 deaths in the United States from pedestrian deaths. There's another about 3,000 that happen in parking lots and driveways, and so don't make it into the official numbers, but that's about a 50% increase over a decade. So when I was writing the book, 6,200 deaths, seems like a bigger number than it does now. Hopefully this whole Corona thing doesn't just numb us to death on a mass scale. Hopefully we'll come out of this with a greater appreciation for protecting our fellow people. But anyway, so a lot of the book tries to get at, why is that occurring? And in this presentation, the idea for this presentation is I want to sort of introduce you to some of the characters in the book, and try to guide you through some of the themes just by introducing them and explaining how they were impacted by this problem. And it's sort of full of spoilers. I don't know if that's a good idea. Like when I was preparing it, I thought, well, maybe this has too many spoilers, but here it goes. We'll see. So the first person I want to introduce is this woman named Raquel Nelson. So in 2010, she's a 29-year-old single mother. She lived in Cobb County, which is north of Atlanta. It's a suburban county north of Atlanta. And it's a really large county. About 1 million people live there, I think. And there's another large suburban county next to it, Gwinnett County. There's another 1 million people there. So these suburbs, these are huge suburban areas. She was crossing the street. Raquel Nelson in 2010, she went out to eat with her family, and she did not have a car. So they took the bus. And in Cobb County, bus service is really bad. This is a county that it was developed by basically segregationists fleeing Atlanta in the 60s. So it was these northern suburbs of Atlanta are totally built around cars. And this county she lived in, someone like her without a car, they had to wait like an hour for their bus. And on the way home this night, they missed their bus. And so they ended up getting back to the apartment complex where they lived in sort of late at night after it was dark. So Raquel Nelson has 3 kids. When she's crossing the road, this is the road. It's called Austell Road. That was between her bus stop and her apartment complex in suburban Atlanta. And her son, if you go back a slide, AJ Newman, he was 4 years old. He got away from her. He got out of her grasp and was hit by a car. And actually Raquel Nelson and one of her daughters was hit in the wreck as well, but not seriously. But AJ Newman, her son, was killed. He was 4 years old. So This actually isn't that unusual of a story in itself. This kind of thing happens all the time across the United States, and it's very common in Atlanta. There's a lot of dangerous roads, and it probably wouldn't have attracted too much attention on its own. But this case ended up being national news because the prosecutor in Cobb County decided to charge Raquel Nelson. He charged her with vehicular homicide in the case. So she ended up facing felony charges after her son was killed by a driver. And I think this is included in a chapter in the book about victim blaming. And you guys who are bike advocates are really familiar with this tendency among the media to just reflectively blame the victim when a pedestrian or a cyclist is killed. It's a big problem, and I think how I talked about earlier, racism, classism. This is a case where it was very clearly an element of racism in that decision to this overzealous prosecution of a Black mother after her son was killed, and in the wreck she herself was injured in as well. So I just want to talk a little bit about the context because it's indicative of one of the reasons that we're seeing this happen more and more in the United States. And I talked a little bit earlier about Cobb County, where she lived. She lived in an area called Marietta. She lived in an apartment complex, probably, a relatively affordable housing complex. So you might have some lower income folks there. It's in this map. This was produced by the University of Cincinnati. And I want to just walk through, I think, we talk a little bit, and I think most people who are conscientious about urban affairs, have heard about the suburbanization of poverty and are thinking a little bit about demographic change in urban areas. But even for myself, someone that's really immersed in it, just looking at these maps was pretty striking for me. So this is a map of racial segregation essentially in Atlanta, and black shows, the green shows, concentrations of where Black people are living, and orange shows white. And also the darker the orange, the more segregated, basically, and the darker the green, the more segregated. So in 1990, you can see how segregated Atlanta is. But if you go to the next slide and you look just 20 years later, there's really been enormous demographic change in Atlanta and in the northern suburbs. They are much more diverse than they were 20 years ago. This is obviously a map of race. So, but also we're seeing different economic realities for folks in a lot of areas around Atlanta. So these counties like Cobb and Gwinnett County that were built, in the 1960s, the height of the auto era, for white people fleeing Atlanta who wanted 2-car garages, are now home to more people like Raquel Nelson, who, for whatever reason, and I think in her case, her license was suspended, which is very common across the country, and it's often discriminatory in itself, but that's an aside. Her license was suspended for some trivial reason, is why she didn't have a car and wasn't driving that night. So this kind of thing, this demographic change, the suburbanization of poverty, is one of the reasons we're seeing these escalating pedestrian deaths. People who rely on transit, people who have to walk, are in these more dangerous areas now than they used to be. And I think gentrification contributes to that. I know that gentrification is a big issue in Atlanta, and that they're seeing a lot of growth even along some of the corridors that were traditionally low income in the suburban areas, are seeing some gentrification now. So, and as you guys probably know, just looking ahead to the next slide, the areas of the South, the Southeast, the Sun Belt are the most dangerous places to walk in the United States. Atlanta being one of them, Florida being the worst. These places that developed later after the advent of air conditioning are the most dangerous places to walk, because that was the highway era. That was the, all the engineers during that time when those areas were developing, they were 100% focused on building the interstate highway system. That was the training they received. That was the big project, the big public works project that all the civil engineers, were sort of geared towards. So those communities are just very hostile. And another demographic reason I think that pedestrian deaths are increasing is because these are the areas that are seeing the fastest growth in the United States. Like even like a Portland, which I think is pretty healthy economically compared to like Cleveland. The growth in Portland, I'm sure, is nothing compared to Phoenix or Houston. Those cities, Houston the Houston area added like 1 million people in the last 10 years. So it's just, Cleveland, there's less than 400,000 people even live in Cleveland anymore. So there's suburbs of Houston now that are larger than Cleveland. So the growth that's happening in the United States in population and the population shifts are not favorable to pedestrians, and it's becoming more of a problem. Just to circle back a little bit, Raquel Nelson she was really brave, and she stood up to the charges, and she asked for she was actually convicted of vehicular homicide in 2011, but the judge who oversaw her case offered her the option of a retrial, and she took it. And she actually took her case all the way to the Georgia Supreme Court. She got, at one point, there was a lot of fanfare about this case, and there was a lot of press. I think she was on Good Morning America or something. The NAACP, the National NAACP, was involved in this case. She had a celebrity pro bono lawyer representing her. She actually lost on appeal at the Supreme Court, but eventually a judge in the case did drop the charges of vehicular homicide. There was another one, I believe, is reckless endangerment, and she ended up pleading guilty to a charge of jaywalking. And so she spent 3 years of her life fighting that charge. And at the end of the day, she was lucky to walk away with a $200 fine. So I think it's just indicative of the way we treat people in these situations too. And this is a case, again, that overlaps a lot with racism. She's one of the characters we discussed. I want to move on and talk about this. Unfortunately, is another really sad case, and it starts off similarly. But this little boy, Neely Saxon Jr. So in 2017, he's another character in the book. In 2017, he's playing with some family and friends at his grandmother's house in Broward County, Florida. He's toddling around this street. He's 22 months. It's sort of a low traffic street. It's not a wide arterial, like in Raquel Nelson's case, where street design was very clearly a culprit. It had speed bumps, that kind of thing. So he's playing on the street, and he's hit by a car. It was sort of this case got a good amount of attention though, because it's sort of a horrific case, but the driver of the car did not stop after they hit this little boy until about 100 feet later. They stopped at a stop sign, and a bunch of onlookers dragged the person out of the car and beat them up. That's part of the reason it got a lot of press. So there was a little bit of a debate then among the family of the victim and the woman who was responsible, about whether she claimed she could not see the boy. And the family claimed she could, and she was trying to flee. So there was mixed opinions about the cause or what happened. But the woman, she was driving a 2007 Honda Fe, which is, or Hyundai Santa Fe, I'm sorry, which is a crossover SUV. And that's another factor that we know is contributing to pedestrian deaths, increasing pedestrian deaths. There's changes going on in the auto market. And I've tweeted a lot about this, anyone who follows me. And it's been reported about a good deal now. It's better known than when I started this book that this is part of the problem. But well, the next slide shows this car. So this is not you know, a super aggressive vehicle. Like now, this is there's a million, every automaker has a car that sort of looks exactly like this. This is considered a mid-size SUV. But in this case, the Broward County Sheriff's Office told the local newspaper, like, this kid, he's 22 months, is shorter than the bumper, and the driver was possibly distracted and couldn't see him. So this is actually the case that got me interested in SUVs and the role they play in pedestrian deaths, because it's just like, how do we have vehicles on the road, allowed on our roads, that entirely obscure a child, and that would be a legitimate excuse to run over this is a person who's standing and not even stop. But the woman in this case who was beaten up, she was never charged, so that excuse worked totally. So this is just a vulnerability we have now in our vehicle stock in the United States. Back in SUVs have been around since the 1990s, but not in such a big way as now. And they had a real resurgence about 20 years ago in the early 2000s, but that was mostly full-size SUVs, and it was a little bit limited. This whole crossover thing is very it's a big change in our vehicle stock in the United States, and it has implications for safety, and it has very bad implications for pedestrians. So this is this graph just shows, it's from the Detroit News, about the mid part of the last decade, we saw crossovers overtake sedans, and pretty much sedans are almost becoming extinct. The big three is hardly making sedans anymore. I was sort of hopeful when this whole Corona thing started. Sometimes like during the last recession, we saw sedans become more popular compared to crossovers, just because crossovers are generally a lot more expensive. Automakers are able to charge about $10,000 to $15,000 extra dollars to sell a crossover versus sedan. And a lot of times they don't cost any more to make. So it's a big profit thing for the auto companies, and it's very popular, no signs of slowing down. But we know that there's not only the blind spot issue, but pedestrians are being hit with bigger, heavier vehicles. Just here's a photo I snapped near my house. It just shows like the size difference of a crossover compared to a sedan. We're replacing these smaller cars with bigger cars, and we're actually not getting, if you look at these two cars, there's really about the same seating capacity. So we're just getting this big, weird, extra space sort of in the leg area. But turns out that can be really, really deadly for pedestrians. Here's an example. The same thing is going on the truck industry, pickup trucks. It's out of control. And no one even, I talk about this a lot in my book, no one even really measures this. No one official is keeping track of how high the front end of cars are. So nobody's been able to study that really in a very scientific way. I actually measured it. Like I went out and just took a tape measure and measured the front end of a few cars just to compare. But a car like this will be a full 1.5 to 2 feet higher than a sedan in the front. And this is a lifted pickup. This is my son. He was 4 at the time, standing in front of this car. So I sort of need to speed through this, I'm realizing. But yeah, there's a big vulnerability with that front end and back end blind spot that these big vehicles come with. This group called kidsandcars.org, they did an experiment. I'm sure a lot of people have seen this on Twitter. They were able to they could only get a certain number of kids to parents to agree to even let them participate in this just photo op thing. But about 50 children can be hidden in the blind zone in the front of these vehicles, and they're getting larger and larger. So those are just an example of a couple of the problems. I think, we're seeing, just to recap a little, more people put in vulnerable positions. There are more people living in the Sun Belt. There's more lower income people out in the suburbs on these roads that are more suburban. And the cars that they're coming in contact with are bigger and deadlier when they get hit. So that's part of the problem. This is a little bit about solutions, this next part, or some progress that's been made, I think. And this is a woman called Amy Tam Lau. She's a New Yorker. Another sad story, actually similar. These stories are a little bit similar, but her daughter Allison was killed in Flushing, Queens in 2013. She was holding her grandmother's hand in a crosswalk and was just hit by a car that cornered too fast. I've seen a video, and it's just someone being kind of a jerk and impatient, and this little girl was killed. But this family is really inspirational. There's a couple of really inspirational families in New York that, with the support of transportation alternatives, have gotten active and are having an impact. So this family, they became one of the founding families in New York, Families for Safe Streets. These are activists or advocates that have all, they're like a subgroup of transportation alternatives, the advocacy group in New York, that are all people who have lost family members to traffic violence. And I think in the book I talk a lot about these folks, because I think it's sort of sad in a lot of these cases how people who are killed in this way, they don't really get their stories told. Like you see with other public health problems like the opioid epidemic, before the corona thing happened, we would see these really humanizing stories. And that had to do a little bit with racism too. And now that, like, compared to the crack epidemic, people would point out where the addicts were really villainized and othered. When we have an opioid epidemic that's impacting white folks and well-off folks, we get these really sympathetic news coverage. But anyway, this problem, you don't often open a newspaper. And I think Portland's a little unusual in this sense, and read oh, here's how someone's life was affected by losing a loved one in a car crash. But it's so common. It's ubiquitous. I think we've almost become sort of bored with it. But having these folks who've really paid a high price, who've lost family members, engaged and sort of leading discussions, I think it's really powerful. Another woman in New York, this is a woman named Amy Cohen. She's sort of famous for anyone who follows traffic safety in New York. Her son was killed in 2013. He was 12, standing outside the park waiting for his soccer practice to start. His ball ran into the street. So in 2014, these families got together, a few others, and they formed the group, and immediately they started making headway. Like Amy Cohen's family would go to city council meetings and hand every single person there a little photo album of their son. And they appeared at meetings a couple weeks after their son was killed, and they were giving this testimony where they're crying and grieving. And I also want to point out, she's a white woman, and her husband's a lawyer, so she has some means. And I think, some people of color in the book, they try to sort of raise the alarm about their family members and were sort of ignored. But in this case, there was sort of a supportive community for her, and she had some advantages, and they've been able to make a lot of progress. The same year that they got active, New York committed to a default lower speed limit, which required them going to Albany and winning a big legislative fight. And the mayor of New York committed to Vision Zero. One of the stories that I think is kind of cool, there's a villain. This guy, Marty Golden. I don't know if you guys would have heard of it, but he's notorious in New York City. He actually, one of their big fights was for speed cameras in school zones. And Marty Golden was a repeat offender. He had, I can't remember how many, I should have looked this up, but he had half a dozen violations for speeding in school zones. He's a state senator in New York. And also he had actually hit someone with his car and caused her death. So I shouldn't laugh about that. It's really serious, but she's an older woman, and he hit her with her car and she eventually died. So he's sort of like the arch villain of this issue. And he got in a big fight with the Families for Safe Street. He tried to, as state senator, he tried to end the speed camera program that they worked really hard to get in place. So they really got active. These women that lost their children, I think are, you can never, the passion they bring to it is really something. They're really heroic. So so 2 years ago, I think it was 2018, they held this protest. In this picture, you can see that's Amy Tamlau and Paul Steely-White from Transportation Alternatives in New York. They were actually arrested. They were outside the governor's office, Andrew Cuomo's office, protesting this. The speed camera legislation was about to expire and the school year was going to start. They didn't want the school year to start with all those shut off. They held up a sign saying children are going to die. And they were blocking traffic and they were arrested. The police, I can't believe that, they arrested this woman who lost her child for protesting. But this advocacy was very effective. In 2 months, the speed cameras were restored by executive order of the governor, 2 months from the state. And then 4 months later, Marty Golden was voted out of office and replaced with a Safe Streets advocate in the New York State legislature. So I'm wrapping up, but here's a picture. Amy Cohen held her own little protest outside Marty Golden's office, 24 hours. And it's a picture of her son, Sammy. He was just a few weeks shy of his bar mitzvah when he was killed. And she said, our children have been killed. We have nothing left to lose. So I think one thing, I think it's important to tell these folks stories and to be sympathetic to them. And also B, I think sort of centering these folks more in our work is a really smart strategy. And if we could activate people who have paid such a high price for some of these issues, I think that could be really game changing. So that's one of the points I try to make as well. And that's sort of it. I think I went a little bit over, but yeah, the book will be released late next month, but it was printed actually last Friday, and it's going to start going out to folks who pre-ordered it anytime. The first one should start showing up by the end of the month. And hopefully, I forget what's the name of your really cool bookstore in Portland. I'm sort of hoping it will be there. When I visited Portland, I went there. I thought that would be cool, but
yeah, I'm sure it'll be on the shelves of Powell's in no time.
I'm such a dork. Like, I'm such a dork from Ohio. But
maybe
yeah,
even on a bestseller list too. So you never know.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. I mean, yeah, it's sad. It's sad not to be able to travel, to do more to promote it. And I don't know how much people are even still going to bookstores, but I appreciate you guys having me to talk about this.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I just want to thank you so much for coming out and sharing all these great thoughts. I did notice that we had a couple of questions, but I did want to also kind of start off with, I've heard Charles Brown speak at previous conferences. Charles Brown, for those who don't know, he's a researcher at Rutgers University, and he actually did your forward, or he wrote your forward for your book as well. And I've heard him use the term and kind of describe himself as a street level researcher, right? That idea that you're trying to develop sort of an understanding on the street, not necessarily from the maps or the models that all these transportation engineers really like to rely on. Can you maybe talk to a little bit more about what sort of maybe street level research that you've done, maybe even writing your book, or sort of in your previous work as at Streets Blog, and how that kind of informed sort of a lot of your, and I kind of see it already in a lot of the slides here. But
so one thing is that I think like I'm kind of come at this from a privileged angle. Like 100%, I do come at this from a privileged angle. One thing about me is I used to be more of a bike advocate, and then once I had children, I changed more to walking.
Mm.
So I was just strolling them. I never did the cargo bike. I do have a cargo bike. I never really got into that. I just switched mostly to walking, and I live in a fairly walkable area, but it was still like infuriating to me every time anyone did anything that I thought was slightly threatening to my kids, you know? But one thing I think, one of my, I think in the United States, most middle class, almost everyone who can afford to doesn't really walk, unless they live in a very like gentrified or walkable, special little sweet spot where they can walk. Like people of means, and it doesn't matter what race they are, but because of discrimination and the wealth gap, people of color are more likely to be poorer and to be lacking vehicles and to be relying on transit. But anyway, I think that's a big part of the problem with this and why it's not recognized more as a problem, because people who like are in influential positions in the media and in government, they're just not having to cross like nine lane roads in Florida with their kids. Otherwise they'd be furious. Like I was furious all the
Yeah.
time, and like child's play, what I was dealing with in Cleveland compared to what a lot of folks deal with on a daily basis. So, I mean, I do think that it's a very localized problem. And I talk about in the book how there's just missing pieces here and there, like things that should be considered essential, sidewalks, streetlights, bus shelters just aren't there, or curb ramps. That can be such a huge problem, such a huge safety hazard. And it puts people in a dangerous position. People get killed. And I don't know why that's acceptable. Like, why did we decide we would never design a highway and then go, oh, like, one element of the highway, whatever, and people are crashing off the side. It would absolutely be taken care of. But we've, for some reason, just made this like executive decision that, pedestrians, and I think that goes back to like the lower status of the people, the lower political status of the people being killed. And the book talks a little bit more about how there's even discriminations in which neighborhoods are receiving treatments, and that's very racially discriminatory as well. White neighborhoods are better able to demand these kind of safety treatments than Black neighborhoods. Instead, the Black neighborhoods are getting enforcement.
Yeah, and maybe you can talk to that a little bit more too. I know that there's, I think, a really healthy debate right now, especially amongst the Black Lives Matter movement, right? Talking about what does enforcement maybe look like, and potentially are there alternatives to policing, right, in order to obtain even better outcomes? Is there do you have any thoughts on that, and kind of what I know that obviously the speed cameras, right, I think are where a lot of folks end up landing, myself included, as a way to potentially reduce interactions with police. But of course, some have pointed out that there's still some inequities in where you place the cameras.
And so
on.
Yeah, it can totally be a problem. They can be used in a discriminatory way. Also, you have to be very careful. Another thing is, it's like, on this kind of thing, I sort of want to defer to the affected group. So like, I'm white, I'm not like a young Black man who's being hassled by the police. And I think like we've got to be working with and deferring to the people who are most affected and letting them sort of lead the discussion about how that should look. And I mean, I actually don't have a really strong opinion about this. There's a little bit of debate about it even within the industry, and the people in Sweden, like I write a little bit about Sweden and Vision Zero in the book, and they don't do enforcement really. It's all street design. But street design is expensive and it takes a long time to roll out. And
it's inherently political, right?
And you have people like in Houston who are getting killed on high-speed highways, that's, they're designed. So I would really defer, these groups that are working on racial justice. I would really defer to them on it. But and I guess
Sure.
I'll just leave it there. Yeah, that
Excellent.
has to be worked out locally, and those people's voices need to be centered in the discussion.
Well, I know that Emily, former co-chair of ViCloud, but she is also here on the chat, and it looks like she's got a couple questions from YouTube for you. So I'm going to let Emily share those.
Awesome. Hello, everyone. I've got one question. So what are the differences in federal pedestrian crash standards for different types of vehicles, like cars, crossover SUVs, full-size SUVs, and trucks?
What was the differences in the federal standards was the question, like the federal safety standards?
Yeah, in federal pedestrian crash standards.
There aren't any pedestrian crash standards right now. The federal government doesn't regulate it at all. They do in Europe. They do in all of our international peers, basically. But in the United States, they just totally don't do it. They've never done it since the 1970s. If you read like Ralph Nader's book, he was arguing they should have done it back in the 70s. And there was a lot more people walking in the 70s, actually, and more people getting killed. Now we've sort of eliminated walking instead of trying to make cars safer. There actually was a push in the Obama administration to at least begin testing cars to see how they perform on pedestrian impacts. And when Trump was elected, he basically quashed it. There hasn't been any progress. So hopefully Trump's going to get, my sanity, everyone, our country, hopefully Trump is going to lose. And, if we're lucky, a Democrat will pick that back up. But right now, yeah, there's not even, some of the private agencies that work on traffic safety have started doing some testing, but it's not even, it's all they're really doing is, it's not the full crashing a car into a dummy and seeing how it performs. And that's just private agencies like Insurance Institute for Highway Safety. It's not the federal government.
That is pretty depressing. Okay, well, the next one that
That's another thing. It's another thing where it comes back to class, I think. Like, the people's whose concerns, vehicle safety concerns, if you're driving anyway.
You mean people who are inside the car are usually seen as more valuable class-wise than those.
And if they're paying a lot of money to buy an expensive SUV and 2 years later it's rolling over and killing them, then that's, congressional hearings are happening about that right away, but not so much for like, bus riders in Florida.
Yeah.
We haven't seen that yet about this problem. Even hot car deaths, even a hot car death, so it's only a few dozen people are killed every year, which I'm actually very supportive. They just made some progress on that, but not the same level of attention to this issue by comparison.
Yeah, I agree with that a lot. We've got another question. Vehicle models are rarely, if ever, mentioned in police communications about crashes. Like, I assume we're saying like police reports, which get picked up by the media. Wondering if that or what other ways we could bring attention to issues with the vehicle size.
Yeah, I think that advocates, so like an advocacy group like Bike Portland, and I actually would love to be involved with efforts like this, should do more, if they can, try to work more with the press, because the press is doing a pretty bad job on this in a lot of places. I think Portland might be an exception, but
I would say we're a C for most of the news publications. We're making progress, but it's uneven, I would say.
Yeah, like a lot of like a television news station. The reporter doing this, that nobody has a transportation beat anymore. They're just spending a few minutes. The coverage is a problem. So I don't know. You could. Sometimes they do mention the vehicle, sometimes they do mention the vehicle make and model, but it's not usually, they don't say, well, and we know that Ford Explorer is an SUV, and SUVs are more dangerous. That's pretty unusual. It would be interesting to see what happened if they start doing that, because I think a lot of people, one of the things that's sad about it is people aren't even informed. People that buy cars, you know, aren't even aware of this risk. Now, would they care? You know, would they care that they were choosing a vehicle that was more likely to kill a pedestrian? Who knows? But they haven't even been informed about the risk.
Okay. And then related to that, I guess, are there strategies that other places have successfully used to push consumers to smaller vehicles?
Other countries, you said?
Just as other places. So I
Yeah.
would assume non-American places.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, a lot of other countries, I know, like in some countries, they tax larger vehicles based on like the number of liters that the engine, how large the engine is, basically. I actually didn't, there are a lot of places just have a lot higher gas taxes or a carbon tax, and that, or petrol, you know, taxes. So that sort of takes care of it, and we don't have that. There's a big discussion about it in this book that I reference a little bit, that was written in the early 2000s by this guy named Keith Bradshaw, called High and Mighty, and he talks about the politics of it. It's basically a little bit of a political problem because the American automakers are very invested in trucks and SUVs. And it's like the foreign automakers like Honda and Toyota that have more of the specialty and have more of the sedan market. So politicians are really hesitant to go after these big three auto companies, big cash cow, because they're employing all these people at good union wages in Rust Belt places that are like definitive swing states. So it's not just, you know, that they're not paying attention. It's tricky. It's tricky with who the interest groups are.
Okay. I had not thought about that. The jobs and in the Rust Belts and also swing states. And yeah, that's a great point.
They're not, almost like these American automakers, that they're almost, none of them are even making sedans anymore. So not looking good on that front.
I've got one more about cars and vehicle design. What do you think about weight/miles tax as a way to discourage driving the most dangerous vehicles?
Yes, I would support that. I think like it's sort of, I don't know. I think like a lot of times there's this sort of, we could all dream up like a policy that we think would be awesome, you know, in an ideal world, but it's sort of like what can happen politically is the bigger question. What is reasonable? How would it work? And it's a much trickier question. So I don't know. I think like we should look at, I think like an easier win would be like, can we start regulating bull bars, which are on the front of cars? Like nobody even regulates that. No one even, when I was in Portland, the police department for TriMet and the Portland police has bull bars on. I all drive SUVs with bull bars on the front. It's like, and probably no one even said to them like, hey, this is bad. So why are like taxpayers in Portland, of all places, are paying extra money to outfit these police cruisers to be extra dangerous, not just for pedestrians, but for the police officers inside them with this extra gear? Like, so there's so many little wins before, like people talk about, oh, it's crazy to outlaw SUVs. And I agree that that doesn't seem like something that would happen imminently, but there's so many little wins in between that are just, they're not even being contested, I feel like.
Like maybe not having maybe like you can only lift your truck so many inches, right? You know, I've seen, I'm 5'9" and I've seen trucks that are lifted so high that like my head comes to the top of the grill. So even getting lifts down, or maybe even banning lifts, seems like that would be a step in the right direction.
I mean, the guys that lift the trucks, you know, they're like, in so many ways, just like a tough group to take on politically. But like, I don't know, like the courage of people like Amy Cohen and stuff to try and stand up to that, because it is such a, I think a lot of people want to throw up their hands and just be like, it's difficult. And if Portland, a place like Portland has a chance to sort of innovate, potentially there are things that could be taken on locally. You know, New York used to ban SUVs from certain highways, and they sort of gave up on that. There's lots of things like they used to give special parking spaces to compact cars. Everyone sort of gave up on that. So, you know, Keith Bradshaw talks about even insurance. Insurance used to charge higher rates for SUVs because they were really way more dangerous. And they even felt pressure not to do that. So I don't know. There's a lot of levers. There's a lot of levers. Of course, yes. Charging more. And one thing Keith Bradshaw talks about is how muscle cars kind of went out of fashion in one at one point because they jacked up the insurance rates a lot. And the people that were driving muscle cars were already expensive people to insure, young men. So that really hurt muscle cars. I don't know. There's a lot. There's a lot that could be done potentially.
Interesting. Well, speaking of that, do you have like a low-hanging fruit to-do list for people who want to advocate about this stuff?
Yeah, that's a good question. One thing I said at the last presentation I did in Portland is I think people should get, I would love to see like advocacy, like there's, you know, advocates in Portland that do great work, get more engaged with vehicle regulation fights, because often like no one shows up for that. And you could potentially, you know, the groups like this could make a difference in that kind of thing. So, you know, if we get a new president, is USDOT gonna bring up the issue of pedestrian crash ratings again? That I think that would be, should be sort of a slam dunk. I think like you know, this is federal stuff, so I guess it's not and never going to be easy at the federal level. But when Joe Biden is putting together spending packages that are supposed to be climate, and we're talking about environmental justice, and I think like some of this stuff could be part of what they call a just reopening, you know. But in some cases, it requires a little bit of money. So where's it going to come from? We could add, you know, if we're pretty small dollar compared to some of these highway projects, we could be making sure every bus rider had a shelter so they don't have to run across the street when they see their bus coming from under a tree across the street or whatever, and put themselves at risk. And in so many ways, Portland's like really far ahead of everyone else. But one thing, I actually pick on Portland a little bit in my book. And I know that in Portland, it's East Portland where the problem is really concentrated. So I think like in Portland, that's where the energy's got to be if you want to have an impact on the problem.
Yeah, I would certainly agree with that. Yeah, we've done some actions around the multi-lane streets that are out there, and that it's a real problem. One question that someone had, like speaking of low cost solutions, was like, what about adding more leading pedestrian interval signals, walk signs, and left turn vehicles in different phases? Like, would you consider that a good interim solution?
Yes.
I guess.
I think Portland is really on top of that, but most places, like these suburban places, they don't even think about it. But yeah, that had a huge impact in New York. These leading pedestrian intervals, they're very inexpensive. I I think like looking at that, I think there are people are in Portland are looking at that kind of stuff critically. I know because I was there and I talked to people about it, but that's very rare. Do people have enough time to physically cross the street? One of the things I talk about in the book is another demographic change that's contributing to the problem is just the population is aging. Older people are more vulnerable. They move slower. They need enough time to cross the street safely. If, you know, it shouldn't be acceptable anymore to time intersections so there's not enough time for an older person to cross safely, or a person that has, you know, mobility challenge. So yes, totally. Another thing I talk about in the book is just basic pieces of infrastructure like street lighting. Some of the lower income communities, neighborhoods of color don't have street lighting, and 3/4 of pedestrian deaths occur at night. So that's a huge problem. And you know, maybe that money can come from some other source that isn't the sidewalks budget or something. I'm not sure.
Okay. Well, I guess this is a question from me. What do you think about allowing people on bikes to get a head start with leading pedestrian intervals?
You know what? I have no idea. Sounds like a good idea. I really have no idea. I'm just trying to even think of how that would work.
Okay.
It sounds like a good idea to me, but I'd have to research it and get back with you before I could.
Well, I'm just thinking of, there's a few intersections in Portland that have a pedestrian intersection, and you just, when you're on a bike, you would just go straight. You don't usually turn. So it seems like it's a mixed bag in terms
they
of.
They should just skip pedestrian. I mean, cyclists should have the I know, stop already. Why haven't we done that? It's so dumb.
Oregon did get the Oregon stop pretty recently, but
for stop signs.
For stop signs, yeah.
Not for stop signals, though.
I think it's a good example of something I talk about in the book. It's just like, it's not really about safety. It's about power. You know, it's about political power. These traffic decisions, I think like people who are like not well versed just think, oh, well, they designed the traffic light that way because that's the safest. And it's like, no, they only gave people 8 seconds to cross the street because they're trying to race these cars through. It's not about safety at all. It's about who sort of interests prevail and what, you know, their positionality in the whole thing.
Well, Angie, I know that you have 2 little ones at home, and I just want to thank you so much. You're also in Columbus, Ohio. Great city, by the way.
Oh, actually, I'm in Cleveland. I had to correct you.
Cleveland. Oh, excuse me.
Okay.
My grandma lives in Toledo. So
Ohio cities. Oh, that's okay.
There you go. Well, thank you again for joining us on such a late evening. I know you know it's already pretty late there.
Yeah, no, it's fun. I love talking about this stuff. So thanks for listening.
You bet. And I just want to encourage everyone once again to please go ahead and support Angie by buying her book. You can find the 20% off discount in the description there, or just look at your screen. Use Schmitt, get 20% off. If you are interested in more Bike Loud stuff here in Portland, you can join us by going to our website, bikeloudpdx.org, and signing up for our newsletter is probably the best way to stay in touch. Although Emily will probably also want me to remind you to also follow us on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and all the other social medias. So thank you, everyone, for coming out. And thanks again, Angie. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, you guys.